Guys, welcome to Global Insights, and today we are very glad to host Dr. Daniel Staetsky, researcher in the Institute for Jewish Policy Research in London. Welcome.
Glad to be here, Alex.
And we would like to understand what will happen in the Middle East following the war between Iran and Israel conflict, Iran and Israel war. What do you see the vectors for the future development in the Middle East?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and an excellent way of starting it, because vector is the most important word here. I've been asked this question in maybe 100 times in the past 3 days or so. And I wasn't asked this question as a scientist. I was asked this question as a member of community, really. People ask me this question: what will happen in the Middle East? Who will win in this war? How can one be sure? What does it all mean? Most people who ask me this question are actually not Jewish, so their knowledge of Middle Eastern realities, Israeli realities, is quite limited. And gradually, I simply understood that, having addressed this question several times, I simply understood that actually demography and Jewish history have a reasonable answer. So the answer that I will bring to the table is not necessarily of a member of a community, or a member of human race, but an answer of a demographer, somebody who knows something about historical demography of Jews. And so let's focus on that. Let's focus on that, and let's have this on the radar at all times. What we're trying to understand and predict is how this current conflict between Israel and Iran will end, in whose favor, let's say, and what it all means for the Middle East. I think first of all, I would like to say that we cannot predict, nobody can predict specific events. But one can predict major movements in history. Looking at the past, resorting to what you called a few times historicism. What actually happened in the past? Where we're all moving? And where Jewish society and human society in general is moving is, in my view, in the following way, and I can prove that. Let's think about human history in the broadest terms. Let's think about human history in a way that Yuval Noah Harari writes about it. He writes tremendous essays. He and others write those tremendous essays, tremendous books covering millennia of human history. And let's ask ourselves what we know about Jewish history in the past 2,000 years or so. Just like that, what we know about Jewish history and what we know about Jewish demography. Why demography? Because demography is a very documented, very empirical part of Jewish history, you could say. It's very difficult to argue against demographic materials very often because they are very well based in numbers. And the history of human society and Jewish society is as follows. We're moving as a society from agricultural society to industrial society to post-industrial society. This movement is something that everybody who listens to us now will recognize. There's nothing to argue about. We started as a society where most people, 99.99%, were engaged in agriculture. They did physical labor in order to produce food, which they then consumed or sold. Then the society moved to a new era, which we called an industrial era, where a lot of functions that people did themselves physically during the agricultural era started fundamentally were done by machines. So that's a significant advancement. And then we moved to the era where economy is dominated by what we now call services. And the technological side of that is, well, we still can call it industrial, but really it's a high-tech. This is a high-tech industry, and that's the fundamental switch. Now let's think for 1 second about how war and war-like activities look in each of these 3 eras. Think about the agricultural era. Again, how does the war look? How does weaponry look in this era? The agricultural war looks a lot like agricultural activity because weapons look like agricultural weapons. Let's just say this. The old war, the old-fashioned war, the war between tribes or nation states, medieval wars, you can even see it in if you look at the let's say art, medieval art. How did they picture the war? There's people who look a lot like peasants, and they have in their hands something like agricultural equipment. Okay, so the nature of the war, and in that's not a big revelation. The nature of the war reflects the nature of the society. If we move up a gear, we go to the industrial era, okay? The war has some elements of agricultural war still, but mostly the symbol of industrial era, the symbol of industrial war is a tank, is a machine. It's a piece of heavy machinery that has been made in a factory. That is the industrial war. Now, so again,
I can give you a few examples. I think the technology, if we are pre-industrial revolution, then a major part of the military strength was the size of the country, because the more size you have, the more population you have, you can recruit more, potentially recruit more soldiers. Once we have the industrial revolution, we are depend on the technology. So the more technology the advanced countries can win even bigger country. For example, the classical example, I think it's the Crimea War in the middle of the 19th century in Russia, between Russia and France and in the United Kingdom. And the good example there is like Russian could fire a bullet to 200 meters, and French and British forces could fire 2,000 meters. So they had the technology advantage, and after this war, Russia decided to go and to industrialize the country because they understood that this is the main disadvantage. To be big in numbers is not enough anymore. And I think currently we are in a different period where it's even not the basic technology, number of tanks and number of rifles. We are in the new era, and maybe you elaborate more. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I must tell you that as an aside, but an important aside, staying still strictly on the topic, that very thing that you mentioned, the size of the population, this is when, so the agricultural war and industrial war are eras where the size of the country's population was critical for this reason, because the size of the army and the capacity, the needed capacity, what is a sensible army to manage the war depended on the size of the population. Also, what that made sensible in the transition between agricultural and industrial and a post-industrial, if you wish, war, the killing, the nature of killing is very different. In agricultural times, in agricultural war, if you wish, to win the war, you had to kill a lot of people because these people actually were fighting against you. Imagine tribal wars, for example, Arab tribal wars that Dr. Mordechai Kedar talks about them. This is tribe fights another tribe. The only sensible way of winning that war is simply to exterminate all capable men in that second tribe. That is needed. That is needed whether you are whether you have humanitarian tendencies or not. The only question that one asks him or herself in conditions of that war is, how do I win that particular war? And there's only one answer: killing as many as possible from the enemy tribe. Now, when we move to industrial times and post-industrial times, that becomes less relevant, less needed, and even counterproductive. And we will talk about this. Counterproductive in the sense that in the postmodern war, most civilian population simply doesn't do anything. It's irrelevant. You wouldn't want to kill them. Of course, that is a sort of a point that is very often made in the press, that civilian population needs to be protected. In a way, that discourse reflects modern sensibilities, and it's sort of behind the developments because in the post-industrial war, there is no point in killing civilian population. Civilian population doesn't call any shots. It doesn't do anything. Imagine for 1 second, just for 1 second, that Iran at this particular moment in history doesn't have any army. The army as army is eradicated. It doesn't have it. What will happen then? Well, unless every single person in Iran arms him or herself with a knife and a fork and moves in the direction of Israel, unless that happens, the war is not going to continue, right? So the moment you eradicated the army, you don't need to deal with civilian population already. So that's something very significant that we ought to remember about the modern war. Incidentally, and this is in another aside, and then I will come back to the main to the main topic of discussion. I was also asked the question several times already, why is it that at present times Israeli strategy in relation to Iran looks so different to Israeli strategy in Gaza? The common perception, the average perception of a Western man and a Western woman is that in Iran, in the case of Iran, Israel does something very surgical. It identifies top military commanders, it maps the whole military system, and it goes and strikes exactly where it can kill those people and nobody else. And that looks very clean, very sanitized, very surgical. And then there are military sites and then nuclear capacities. But all of that doesn't involve any civilian population. And that, in their head, is very different, and they don't know why, from Gaza. Gaza appears to them as some sort of meat grinder, right? Where actually a lot of civilians die. And so they ask themselves, why is it that, being so surgical in Iran, Israel is not so surgical in Gaza? And the explanation, of course, is Iran, whatever we think about it, is a normal country. There was a separate military. That military, you can very pragmatically, without any sentiments or humanitarian concerns, map and go for that, because that structure
Iran is supporting terror. Iran
Yeah.
is supporting terror by itself. It's still a country. It's a country
Yeah.
with an organized structure when you have a military, civilian, and that's the main difference. And while you are dealing with the terrorist entity like Hamas, you have in fact the military Hamas part melted into the population. You cannot distinguish them. It's very hard to specifically hit the Hamas without hurting the surrounding population.
Absolutely, because
and that's the target. That's the goal of Hamas. That's the goal of Hamas, to cause more casualties to the civilian population.
Exactly. So the point being, in this particular case, in the case of Iran, that hurting civilian population is something that's not done, not just because of humanitarian considerations, it's just counter-effective. You don't need to do that. Civilian population plays no part, by and large, in the postmodern, if you wish, post-industrial war. It simply doesn't. So all of your energies, if you will have to be directed towards controlling enemy's technology and the chain of command. And we see, if you wish, a distilled example of that. That's very important. Of that, the Iranian war, Israeli-Iranian war, is simply a window, okay, into the postmodern world, if you wish. That's how the new war, and we haven't prepared ourselves to this war, because the contours of this war are just coming to us. This war will look exactly like that. This new postmodern war. The role of countries' population, whether it's 100 million or 10 million, almost 100 million like Iran, or 10 million like Israel, is completely irrelevant, or borderline.
So in the postmodern world, it's becoming about the technology, because in fact, technology in many aspects replaces the human resource. And we see the same in the war between Russia and Ukraine, by the way.
Yeah. I think the difference between the two, I mean, it's a difference of visibility, if you wish. Iran-Israel war is looking at you, talking at you from every single screen, in every single house. And I think people's perception of that is very sharp. They understand exactly what's happening, that Israel actually mapped people in the chain of command, that it mapped the whole of Iran, etc., etc. And that looks surgical. It is surgical for good reason. For good reason. We really observe a new stage of war. Now, then to go back to the question of where it's all going and how would we know and what makes me speak about this with such degree of confidence, well, let's think about it. This is a very good point of departure. Who is going to win in this postmodern war? If it's not somebody who controls the numbers, right? If it's not somebody who can present large number of soldiers, and it's not somebody who can present large number of tanks either. It's somebody who can present, in this particular case, very sophisticated technology of mapping, of direct strikes, of, let's say, smart equipment. That is the person who controls, or an entity that controls the outcome of that war. The moment the question about the future is presented in this way, the answer is very easy to find. Israel, in this particular day and age, is a known, it's not a big secret, as a high-tech empire, really. It's known as a high-tech empire both with relation to civic capabilities, but also in relation to military capabilities. And we see the results of that. We see the results of that particular status of Israel. Iran has never been on that page. So I think the outcome of war is sort of self-evident almost. It's difficult for Israelis to talk about this and to adopt this very optimistic way of viewing things simply because there are civilian deaths now in Israel. And that's necessarily, that will impact on the national mood, on what people say, on the type of commentary. But I think we need to be very clear-headed and clear-eyed with that particular difference, the abyss between Israel and Iran in technological capabilities, advanced technological capabilities, and the new era that the war has entered. Now, if we embed this into the broader framework of Jewish history, I would like to say a few words about that and to cycle back, so to speak, to the description, this three phases of societies, if you wish, and war: the agricultural, the industrial, and highly technological, high-tech society, and the war that reflects that. Think about Jewish history in the past 2,000 years or 1,000 years. The past 1,000 years or so have been, by Jews, have been spent, well, in large part in Europe, and there's a very significant, there's a profound meaning to that. Think about roles that Jews played in a society whilst they lived in the diaspora, in Western and Eastern Europe. Well, when they were embedded in the agricultural societies and in the industrializing societies, Jewish advantage and Jewish drama simultaneously had to do with the fact that Jews were ahead of others. We were simply one gear or half a gear ahead of others. Jewish society in its diaspora stage occupied a particular economic and, let's say, sociological niche within Western, evolving Western societies, where it did not share the agenda, if you wish, of people around them. They were not agriculturalists, the majority of them. For example, and within the societies, they played specific roles that, let's say, they became, they talk nowadays with, of stereotypes of a Jew. It's somebody who doesn't do menial labor, right? It's somebody who deals with something with money, for example, intellectual activity. Well, that's not a stereotype. That's the truth about the Jewish existence in the diaspora, and there are many books that describe that, and there are many attempts to explain that very thing. But one thing is for sure. In that sense, Jews became a society that offered its services to the majority. And by offering these services, it was ahead. It established, if you wish, an alternative economy, a minority economy in a society that was behind, that could not develop these particular services on its own. Now, what we must add to that as well, that Jews in the diaspora existed as a minority. And minority means one and only thing: political vulnerability. It's a lack of capacity to defend themselves effectively, to develop sophisticated even mental system, how to do that, to study war, to develop techniques of war. This is not something that you can do, and no matter where you live as a minority. All you have to do is to develop mechanisms of containing it all. It expressed this particular situation of Jews being a minority, Jews occupying particular positions in society, right? Creating minority economies, supplying particular services. This is something that was reflected in a very strong way in Jewish demography in all times. And by demography, I mean processes, physical processes that were observed among Jews, whether it's fertility, whether it's mortality. If you look at all of these processes, Jews were ahead of others in them. And they developed specific characteristics that indicated very, very unambiguous in a quantifiable way that they were averse to anything that would, averse to any type of conflict. It changed the Jewish psyche. It changed Jewish behavior. It changed behavior of Jewish males, okay? I will give a few examples, something that people may or may not know. Demographers' favorite topic is the study of Jewish mortality in general. The way we die, the pace in which we die, diseases from which we die, reflects the quality of our lives. And all diseases can be, or all causes of death can be divided more or less into two: the natural causes that are related to deterioration of the body. We can think about the body as a machine that eventually breaks, that works and breaks. And there are various causes that do that: cancer, heart disease, etc. And what's called external causes. External causes have nothing to do with natural deterioration. It has everything to do with accidents. And accidents very often derive from involvement in risky activities, okay, from lack of care, from antisocial behavior, etc. It may or may not surprise you that no matter where you look, and I'm talking about the documented chunks of history of Jewish diaspora, you see that that particular element related to risky behavior, risk-taking, is very, very low in Jews and Jewish men in particular. And that indicates to you, as they say in Hebrew, testifies as 1,000 witnesses, that there is something different to the structure of thinking, to the culture of that society. It's a society that is averse of conflict. Before any demographic data, by the way, was available on that topic, Immanuel Kant, no less, in one of his compositions, stated the following thing, and it was an incredibly insightful thing to say. He said the following, that there are three groups in the society, and he was observing society, well, effectively German society of his time. There are three groups in the society that are very careful. They behave in a very careful way. The groups are Jews, women, and priests. Okay, no connection between them. They're very different. The only common denominator that he identified, without looking at any data, was that these people are very careful. They don't involve themselves in antisocial activities. They don't become drunk, for example. That's something that he mentioned. Looking at the data much later, when the data became available, it became clear that he was right on three accounts, all three accounts. Up until this very day, Jews, monks, nuns, priests, and women are the groups with low mortality. which means more protective, more self-protective, and less risky lifestyle. We see it across all cultures. We see it across all continents. We see it absolutely everywhere. The question then became why, and to that, Immanuel Kant had its answer. These three groups are politically vulnerable. The price that they pay for bad behavior is higher than it would be for men, for example. The standards of behavior that are expected from them are higher. The price they pay for misbehaving is higher. They adapt to that. Women have different political vulnerability from Jews, and Jews different vulnerability from priests, nuns, but still there's a social desirability, there's certain expectation. In Jewish case, and in Jewish case in particular, it stemmed from the fact that Jews could not afford bad behavior. They simply could not afford that. And so they adapted in this particular conflict avoidant way. That's how Jews lived. That's what shaped very significantly their psyche over the years. Now, with the establishment of Jewish sovereign state, one cannot say that this pattern will break in one day, in one moment. But certainly the Jewish capabilities now are much wider. That's one thing. So having covered that thing, that this particular avoidance of conflict, there's something very significant to Jewish psyche. That's one thing. And the existence of a Jewish sovereign society and sovereign state removes that particular, if you wish, obstacle. The whole purpose of the establishment of Israel, of modern Israel, I must say, was to normalize the Jewish existence, to remove that factor of lack of control over political fate, of ultimate political vulnerability, so Jews can be like anyone else. They can establish their army, and then they exercise the same degrees of freedom as everyone else. But something else happened. Not but, and something else happened. Being in the diaspora for such a long time, occupying these economic, if you wish, and social positions, which were ahead, let's say, of society, for a while, this is also something that's ended. Now, this ended not because Jews developed their own state, in a way, but it's a completely different story. The entire society moved into a different era. The entire society became more Jewish than it was in the past, in its ways of life, in types of economic occupations. The Jewish occupations became everyone's occupations. There's a very interesting book, I must say, that makes this particular starking statement about non-Jewish society. The book is called Jewish Century. It's written by a historian, an eminent historian of this time, Yuri Sleskin. He talks about the 20th century, and he calls the 20th century Jewish century. Superficially speaking, if you just look at the title, you may think that, okay, he probably talks about how Jews succeeded in the 20th century or shaped the 20th century. That's not the center of the book. The center of the statement is actually much more sophisticated and very much aligned with my message today. It's not that Jews ruled the 20th century. It's that the 20th century was a point in time where agricultural, industrial societies of the past finally moved became Jewish in their ways of life. Finally, the services economy became dominating. So a lot of people from non-Jewish society adopted those occupations. That world now went, the previously Jewish world of economic and social being went mainstream. And it is in this world in particular that Jews have the Jewish game equalized, if you wish. Okay, Jews in a way became like everyone else. The competition now is the competition of the brain, not of numbers, not even of machines. And so any kind of competition, any kind of outcome will be decided about who develops a smarter device, who uses that some smarter device in a smarter manner. And the
And
moment we
in fact,
define
now,
that,
if previously the size of the country, the population was very vital part of the success because you need the numbers, once the devices became the main thing, then you can be a smaller country, but with better technology, maybe with more smart devices, and then you can win even larger country which has bigger population.
absolutely, whoever rules that technology rules the world, and it's not a particularly Jewish or non-Jewish characteristic. It's a message that can be read within, in a way, world history as much as Jewish history. So if there is a question, who will win this war and why, there are reasons to be confident about it. There is only one answer. If you keep the finger on the pulse of world history and Jewish history, that answer is very clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is very interesting topic, and we are currently, I think, facing the first wars of postmodern times, we can say. It's like Ukraine and Russia, Israel in Iran now, and maybe we will have more to come. But again, thank you very much.
Thank you.